In this video we examine new reports and claims surrounding a large-scale U.S. airstrike said to have targeted Iranian missile storage facilities, with sources stating that B-2 bombers were involved in the operation. According to regional monitoring reports and defense analysts, several suspected missile depot locations were struck in what appears to have been a coordinated and highly precise attack. Sources report that the initial impacts were followed by powerful secondary explosions, believed to have been caused by stored munitions detonating inside the targeted depots after the strike. These chain reactions are said to have significantly increased the scale of the destruction, producing massive fireballs, heavy shockwaves, and thick columns of smoke that remained visible long after the explosions. Early assessments indicate that multiple facilities suffered major structural damage, with some areas reportedly destroyed while others were left burning for hours after the incident. Witness reports also describe strong blast waves that were felt in surrounding areas, suggesting that large quantities of weapons or fuel may have been stored at the sites. The video looks at how the reported strike may have unfolded, what could have caused the intense secondary detonations inside the missile storage locations, and why attacks on such facilities often lead to far greater destruction than the initial bombing itself. We also explore the possible wider impact of a strike of this scale as regional tensions remain high and military activity continues to draw global attention. Script. Tensions across the Middle East picked up fast this week after reports confirmed that U.S. forces carried out precision strikes on missile storage sites linked to Iran's military network late at night under low visibility conditions. Officials in Washington did not release full operational details right away, but defense sources told reporters the strikes were aimed at facilities believed to support missile deployment across several conflict zones in the region. The situation has people on edge because any direct hit on Iranian military infrastructure usually signals that things behind the scenes have already been heating up for a while before the public even hears about it. According to analysts who follow regional security closely, the locations targeted were not random sites but places long suspected of being part of Iran's missile storage and distribution system. These kinds of facilities are often built in reinforced areas, sometimes near mountains or underground complexes, making them harder to destroy and harder to monitor from the outside. Reports say the aircraft involved in the operation approached from long range, using flight paths designed to avoid early detection, which suggests the strike was planned well in advance and not a last-minute reaction. People familiar with U.S. air operations say missions like this usually take days of preparation, including surveillance, coordination with allies, and timing the strike to limit the risk of wider escalation. Witness accounts from nearby areas described hearing multiple explosions within minutes of each other, which points to a coordinated strike rather than a single attack on one location. When missile depots are hit, the damage often keeps going after the first impact because stored fuel, warheads, and support equipment can ignite and cause additional blasts. That appears to be what happened here, with monitoring groups reporting secondary explosions that continued for some time after the first wave of bombs hit their targets. Satellite images released later showed smoke rising from several locations, and while officials avoided giving exact coordinates, the pattern suggested more than one storage area was affected. The Pentagon kept its public statement short, saying the strike was intended to reduce threats to U.S. forces and partners in the region, which is the kind of wording usually used when tensions are already running high. What makes this situation different is the timing, because the strike happened while several flashpoints across the Middle East were already getting more unstable at the same time. U.S. troops remain stationed in multiple countries in the region, and any sign that missile systems could be used against those positions tends to trigger a faster response than usual. Military experts say missile depots are considered high-priority targets because destroying stored weapons can slow down future attacks without needing to hit active launch sites. The challenge is that these facilities are often tied into larger networks, meaning one strike can have ripple effects that go far beyond the original location. Iran has invested heavily in missile programs over the years, partly because missiles allow them to project power without relying on large air forces. That strategy has made missile storage sites some of the most sensitive pieces of infrastructure in the region, and any attack on them gets noticed right away. Officials in Tehran did not confirm the full extent of the damage, but state media acknowledged that explosions had taken place at military-linked locations. When statements come out that carefully worded, analysts usually assume the situation is still developing and governments are deciding how much they want to reveal. People in nearby towns reported feeling shockwaves strong enough to shake windows, which lines up with what typically happens when stored munitions start detonating after an airstrike. Emergency crews were seen moving toward the affected areas, although reports suggested access was limited because of fires and the risk of additional explosions. Fires at missile storage sites can burn for hours, sometimes longer, because the materials inside are designed to withstand heat and pressure under normal conditions. That makes cleanup slower and makes it harder to figure out exactly how much equipment was lost in the strike. U.S. officials avoided saying how many aircraft were involved, but the scale of the blast suggests more than one bomber or strike platform took part in the operation. In past missions, long-range bombers have been used for similar targets because they can carry heavier payloads and hit several locations in the same run. The fact that multiple sites were reportedly hit at once has led some analysts to believe the strike was meant to send a message as much as it was meant to destroy equipment. In the Middle East, signaling strength is often part of the strategy, especially when several countries are watching closely to see how far the U.S. is willing to go. Allies in the region did not comment in detail, but officials in a few capitals said they were aware of the operation before it happened, which suggests coordination behind the scenes. That kind of coordination usually means leaders were worried about the situation getting worse if nothing was done. Over the past months, there have been repeated warnings about missile transfers, drone activity, and growing risks around U.S. bases and shipping routes. When those warnings start stacking up, military planners often prepare options ahead of time in case a strike becomes necessary. One thing observer noticed right away was how quickly the operation ended, which may mean the targets were specific and limited rather than part of a larger campaign. Still, even a limited strike can change the mood in the region overnight, especially when it involves direct action against Iranian-linked sites. Markets reacted cautiously the next morning, with energy traders watching closely for any sign that the conflict could spread toward major shipping lanes. The Middle East handles a huge amount of global energy traffic, so even a small escalation can make people nervous about supply routes. U.S. officials tried to calm those fears by saying the strike was defensive in nature and not the start of a wider offensive. That kind of statement is meant to keep the situation from spiraling, but history shows that responses don't always stay limited once both sides feel pressure. Iran has responded to strikes in different ways in the past, sometimes through direct action and sometimes through allied groups in nearby countries. Because of that, analysts are now watching several hotspots at once instead of focusing only on the locations that were hit. U.S. forces in the region have increased alert levels before during similar situations, and signs of tighter security started showing up soon after the reports of the strike. Ships, bases, and air defenses all tend to go on higher readiness when there is a chance of retaliation. None of this means a larger conflict is guaranteed, but it does mean the margin for mistakes gets smaller. When multiple countries are moving equipment, aircraft, and ships at the same time, even a small incident can turn into something bigger than anyone planned. That's why officials on all sides usually choose their words carefully right after a strike like this. The goal is to show strength without locking themselves into a response that forces the situation to escalate further. Right now, the focus remains on the damage to the missile depots and what that means for Iran's ability to move weapons around the region. Early assessments suggest the strikes hit storage areas rather than active launch sites, which fits the pattern of trying to limit future threats instead of starting open conflict. Even so, hitting storage facilities can still carry serious political weight, because those sites are part of long-term military planning. And when long-term planning gets disrupted by airstrikes, the next moves on every side start getting a lot harder to predict. As the first reports settled in, attention quickly shifted from the explosions themselves to what the strike could mean for the balance of power across a region where small moves sometimes lead to very big consequences. Defense analysts in the United States said the choice to hit missile storage locations instead of active launch sites suggests the goal was to reduce risk without pushing the situation into a full-scale confrontation. Even so, targeting infrastructure tied to Iran's missile program is never a casual decision, because those systems are seen as one of the country's main ways to project influence beyond its borders. Over the past decade, Iran has relied more on missiles and drones than traditional air power, building networks that allow equipment to move quietly between different locations. Because of that, storage depots play a bigger role than most people realize, acting as staging points where weapons can be prepared, repaired, or moved depending on what the situation calls for. When those depots are hit, the impact is not only physical but also logistical, since replacing stored equipment takes time and often requires shifting resources from other areas. U.S. officials did not say how long the planning for this operation lasted, but missions involving multiple targets usually involve surveillance flights, satellite tracking, and coordination with regional partners. That kind of preparation also helps avoid hitting the wrong locations, which is something military planners try hard to prevent when the political stakes are already high. People who follow air operations closely noticed that the strike appeared to happen during hours when air traffic was minimal, a detail that often points to an effort to reduce the chance of interference. Timing like that also makes it harder for radar systems to react quickly, especially if the approach comes from directions that are not normally expected. After the blasts were reported, monitoring groups began looking for signs of follow-up activity, since some strikes are designed to test defenses as much as to destroy equipment. In this case, there were no immediate signs of a second wave, which led some observers to believe the mission had very specific limits from the start. Limiting a strike can be just as important as launching one, because once attacks go beyond a certain point, it becomes harder for leaders to keep the situation under control. Governments across the region reacted carefully, with most statements focusing on stability and restraint rather than taking strong public positions right away. That kind of language usually means officials are still trying to figure out how serious the situation really is before deciding what to say next. Behind the scenes, though, security forces in several countries increased readiness levels, something that tends to happen whenever there is a risk of retaliation. Retaliation does not always come in the same form as the original strike, and in the Middle East it can show up in places far from where the first attack happened. Shipping routes, military bases, and even communication networks sometimes become part of the picture when tensions start rising at this level. Because of that, the strike on the missile depots was watched closely not just in Tehran and Washington, but also in capitals across Europe and Asia. Energy markets also paid attention, since any conflict involving Iran has the potential to affect major supply routes that run through nearby waters. Traders reacted cautiously rather than dramatically, which suggests that for now most people believe the situation could stay limited if both sides avoid sudden moves. Still, history shows that limited strikes do not always stay limited, especially when political pressure builds on leaders to respond in some way. Iranian officials said the country would review the damage and decide on the appropriate reaction, a phrase that usually means several options are being considered at the same time. Those options can range from diplomatic complaints to military steps taken through allied groups, depending on what leaders believe will send the right signal. The United States has dealt with similar responses before, which is why forces in the region often shift into higher alert as soon as a strike like this becomes public. Air defenses, naval patrols, and base security all tend to tighten at once, not because retaliation is certain, but because the risk is higher than normal. One reason missile depots were chosen as targets could be that they are easier to justify as defensive strikes compared to hitting command centers or government buildings. Destroying stored weapons can be explained as preventing future attacks, which makes it easier for officials to argue that the operation was meant to reduce danger rather than create it. That argument matters not only internationally but also at home, where leaders have to explain why force was used and what they expect to happen next. In Washington, lawmakers from both parties asked for briefings, which is standard after operations that could lead to wider conflict. Those briefings usually include classified details that are not released to the public, especially information about how the targets were selected. Meanwhile, images from the affected areas continued to circulate online, showing smoke, damaged structures, and emergency crews working around debris. Independent analysts compared those images with older satellite photos to figure out which buildings were likely used for storage and which were support facilities. Early comparisons suggested that at least some of the damaged structures matched locations previously identified as part of missile-related networks. That does not always mean everything stored there was destroyed, but it does indicate the strike hit places that had been watched for a long time. Another detail observers pointed out was the lack of reports about civilian areas being affected, something planners usually try to avoid to keep the situation from escalating politically. Avoiding civilian damage helps limit international backlash, which can become a problem even for countries that support the overall goal of reducing threats. The careful wording used by officials after the strike suggests that keeping the conflict contained is still the main priority. Containing a conflict in the Middle East is never simple, though, because so many different groups and countries are connected to the same chain of events. A strike in one place can trigger reaction somewhere else, sometimes days later, which makes the situation harder to predict than it looks at first. That uncertainty is why military planners often prepare for several possible outcomes instead of assuming the situation will go only one way. For now, the focus remains on how much damage the missile depots actually took and whether the strike changed anything on the ground in a meaningful way. If the facilities were heavily damaged, it could slow down the movement of weapons for a while, which may have been the main goal from the start. If the damage was limited, the strike could still send a message, but it might not change the overall balance as much as some people expect. Either way, the operation has already added another layer of tension to a region that was dealing with several problems at the same time. Leaders now have to decide whether to keep things from heating up further or to respond in ways that could push the situation into a more dangerous phase. That decision rarely happens in public, and the real discussions usually take place behind closed doors between military and political officials. Until those decisions are made, the safest assumption is that forces on all sides will stay alert and ready for the possibility of more activity. Moments like this often become turning points later on, even if they do not look that way at the time they happen. And with missile depots damaged, tensions rising, and several countries watching closely, the next move from either side could shape what the region looks like in the weeks ahead. As damage assessments continued, analysts began looking beyond the strike itself and started asking what this operation says about the current rules of engagement between the United States and Iran. In past years, both sides have tried to avoid direct confrontation, often responding indirectly instead of targeting each other's core military infrastructure. That is why a strike on missile storage sites stands out, because those facilities are tied to long-term strategy rather than immediate battlefield activity. When long-term assets are hit, it usually means planners believe the risk of waiting is greater than the risk of acting. U.S. officials describe the operation as defensive, but the level of coordination involved shows that the possibility of action had been on the table for some time. Military operations that involve multiple targets rarely happen overnight, since they require surveillance, planning, and approval at several levels before anything moves forward. That preparation suggests the strike was not only about one incident but about a broader concern over how weapons were being positioned across the region. Over the last few years, missile and drone technology has changed the way conflicts play out in the Middle East, making storage locations more important than ever. Instead of keeping equipment in one place, networks are often spread out, with supplies moved between facilities depending on the situation. Because of that, hitting storage depots can slow down operations without needing to strike active launch sites, which helps avoid immediate escalation. Even with that approach, the political impact can still be serious, especially when the country being targeted sees the strike as a direct challenge. Iranian officials said the country would respond at a time and place of its choosing, a phrase that has been used before during periods of tension. Statements like that leave room for many possibilities, from diplomatic moves to actions carried out through allied forces in nearby regions. The United States has dealt with those kinds of responses before, which is why security levels around bases and ships often increase after a strike becomes public. In situations like this, readiness is not about expecting something to happen immediately, but about making sure nothing catches forces off guard. One thing observer noticed is that communication between governments did not completely stop after the strike, which can be a sign that both sides want to keep the situation from getting out of control. Even during tense moments, messages are often passed quietly through diplomatic channels to avoid misunderstandings that could make things worse. Those back-channel talks rarely make headlines, but they can play a big role in keeping a limited conflict from turning into something larger. At the same time, leaders also must think about how their actions look to allies, since credibility can matter just as much as the actual damage done. If a country appears unwilling to respond to threats, partners may start questioning how reliable its support will be in the future. On the other hand, responding too strongly can pull more countries into the situation, which is something most governments try to avoid. That balance between showing strength and avoiding escalation is one of the hardest parts of managing conflicts in the Middle East. The region has so many overlapping disputes that one strike can affect negotiations, alliances, and security plans all at the same time. Because of that, analysts are watching not only Iran and the United States, but also nearby countries that could be affected by any shift in the situation. Some governments have already called for restraint, using careful language that shows concern without openly taking sides. That kind of response usually means leaders want to keep trade routes stable and avoid disruptions that could spread beyond the conflict itself. Shipping lanes, air routes, and military bases all depend on the region staying relatively predictable, even when tensions are high. When predictability starts to fade, insurance costs rise, patrols increase, and every small incident gets more attention than usual. The strike on the missile depots has not caused that level of disruption yet, but it has reminded everyone how quickly the situation can change. For the United States, the challenge now is to show that the operation achieved its goal without creating pressure for a larger campaign. For Iran, the decision is whether to respond in a way that restores deterrence without opening the door to a direct confrontation. Both sides have handled similar moments before, but each situation comes with its own risks depending on what else is happening at the same time. Right now, the region is already dealing with several separate tensions, which makes every new development feel more serious than it might otherwise. That is why analysts are paying close attention to what happens in the days after the strike instead of focusing only on the night it happened. Sometimes the most important moves come later, once leaders have had time to measure the reaction and decide how far they want to go. Military forces across the region are likely to stay on higher alert for a while, even if no immediate response takes place. Staying ready does not mean conflict is certain, but it does mean planners are not taking chances until the situation settles down. For people watching from the outside, the lack of instant escalation can make the strike seem less important than it really is. Operations like this often shape future decisions in ways that only become clear weeks or months later. Every time missile infrastructure is hit, it forces adjustments in planning, supply, and strategy, and those adjustments can change the balance over time. That is why even limited strikes get studied closely by military analysts, because they show how far countries are willing to go under pressure. The latest operation sends a signal that the United States is still ready to act if it believes its forces or partners are at risk. At the same time, the careful wording after the strike suggests there is no interest in turning the situation into a wider war. Whether that balance holds depends on what happens next, and that part is never completely predictable in this region. One response, one miscalculation, or one unexpected incident can push events in a direction nobody originally planned. For now, the missile depots that were hit remain the center of attention, as investigators and officials continue trying to measure the real impact of the strike. The full picture may take time to come together, especially if some of the damaged facilities were underground or difficult to access. Until those details become clear, governments will likely keep their statements cautious while they watch each other's next move. Moments like this rarely end with one operation, and history shows that what follows can matter more than the strike itself. With tensions still high, forces on alert, and several countries waiting to see what happens next, the situation remains open, uncertain, and closely watched by the rest of the world.